When I say the word prosecutor, what phrase immediately comes to mind? Tough on crime? Aggressive? Overbearing and rigid in appearance? You ask my wife and she might jump right to arrogant. I'll admit that these stereotypes aren't too far off base, but I want to let you in on a little secret. That's exactly what we're taught. We are taught to confidently stride into that courtroom with that tough, hardened exterior because that's what our community expects. We as prosecutors are honored to stand before judges and juries every day, advocating on behalf of those who have been injured or killed. And I've accepted that persona, being the voice for the voiceless, and its accompanying expectations, entering into courtrooms more times than I can count, carrying the weight of someone else's trauma. The murder victim's family, the sexual assault survivor, the young child victimized in ways we can't possibly understand. But not once during law school or in the early days of my career did anyone tell me that this job could impact me too. I remember as a very young lawyer, the first time I was asked to attend an autopsy. The victim was an 11-year-old boy. He had been strangled to death, placed in a duffel bag, thrown in a construction dumpster in the middle of January. His body was frozen solid. No one should be victimized that way. And no one should ever have to experience what I saw and heard that day. I could only take a few minutes in that autopsy room before I had to excuse myself for my own mental health. And instead of being met with sympathy, I was teased, handed a stick of gum, and told to get back in there. The best way to deal with it is simply to get back to work. So I did. For the next 25 years, sexual assault on child, homicides, domestic violence, adult sexual assaults. I rose through the ranks from that young deputy district attorney to district attorney. I watched as passionate criminal justice professionals burned out, quit, self-medicated with alcohol, and I didn't really stop to think about why. And then in 2018, my wife and a close friend of hers invited a well-known television journalist named Anastasia Bolton onto their podcast, and she talked about covering numerous tragedies over the course of her career, to include the Aurora Theater shooting. And she talked about how it impacted her and her camera person. And as I listened, it made complete sense to me, for after all, she too was there, hearing the sounds, smelling the smells, seeing the faces of our first responders. She called it vicarious trauma, the emotional residue of exposure to traumatic stories and witnessing the fear, the pain, the terror that others have experienced. Some people call it the cost of caring. I had heard that term before, vicarious trauma, in relation to our military and our first responders, law enforcement, fire, emergency medical professionals. Yet still I had no recognition that vicarious trauma could impact me too. It was just part of the job, right? August 2018, Frederick, Colorado. A man whose name will not come out of my mouth stood before the television cameras, feigned concern, and lied to the public, claiming he needed the information about the whereabouts of his missing wife and 2 young daughters. But something was off. And within just a matter of a couple of days, we learned that this was a calculated charade by a monster who had annihilated his family, murdered his wife, his 4-year-old daughter, and his 3-year-old daughter. He buried his wife and their unborn son in a shallow grave outside of an oil tank battery. He smothered his daughters with his own hands and shoved them into those oil tanks, through an 8-inch diameter hatch at the top of those tanks. Not the same tank, different tanks, thereby ensuring that they would be alone in death. Once again, my partners and I readied ourselves to enter into that courtroom to be the voice for the innocent, to be the voice for that young pregnant mother and her 2 daughters. We were going to get justice for her killer. At the time, as the district attorney, I had a team of lawyers and investigators working for me, and I let them take the lead early in this investigation. And for my own mental health, I refused to look at the crime scene evidence. But at the time, Colorado still had the death penalty. And I knew that if we were going to consider seeking the ultimate punishment, I had to see for myself what he had done. So one night that fall, sitting on my couch next to my wife, I opened my laptop to look at the photos which documented the recovery of those little girls' bodies from those oil tanks by hazardous materials crews. What I saw were 2 little blonde girls' lifeless bodies covered in oil. I mentioned their hair color for this simple reason. I too had a 3.5-year-old daughter with long blonde hair. And as I looked at those photos, I looked up at my daughter singing and dancing in my living room, and something happened. I was lightheaded. I got tunnel vision. I felt like I was going to faint, and I felt like I was going to throw up. My wife watched as a very dark shadow cast over my face, and it had finally happened. All of the evil, all of the pain, all of the trauma that I had seen finally spilled over. That was the moment I realized this job had changed me forever. Where I live in Weld County, Colorado, we have a robust oil and gas industry. And you can't hardly drive down a rural county road without seeing a cluster of oil tanks. And to this day, every time I drive by one of those tanks, I see those little girls and I see my daughter. My mind goes back to that very dark place that I found myself in the fall of 2018, and I am filled with rage for what those little girls endured, for what all those victims endured. Vicarious trauma is real, not just for prosecutors. It is a daily reality for legal secretaries, victim advocates, investigators, attorneys, and supervisors. That case changed all of us, but it also made me realize that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. Instead, we as criminal justice professionals must proactively take care of ourselves and one another. That old narrative of the tough, aggressive prosecutor who ignores his or her own mental health for the sake of the job is being crumpled up and thrown away like the trash that it is. Because the Frederick case isn't some outlier or anomaly. Criminal justice professionals see the worst that human beings can do to one another on a daily basis. When I think back to what I wish I knew when I was a young prosecutor, or what I wish I had as a young prosecutor, it was for a culture which gave me permission, when I was having a bad day, to simply walk down the hall to someone's office who I trust, shut the door, and talk about everything that was going through my mind. So we decided to do just that. Create a peer support system in our office for our deputy district attorneys, our investigators, our victim advocates, our administrative professionals. Under the guidance of a former law enforcement officer and trained counselor, we recruited volunteers for a rigorous training program to become a member of this peer support team. This team, including employees from my own office, are not trained to provide professional mental health counseling, but instead to be that immediate resource, to lend an ear to a colleague who simply needs to talk about everything that's going through their mind at the time. No appointment is necessary, and no time off of work. It is as simple as a phone call to say, can I talk to you in your capacity as a peer support officer or member? Then we set aside an office in a quiet corner of our building, complete with comfortable chairs, resource materials, and a welcoming atmosphere. But it's not just our office. We are part of a nationwide movement of prosecutors challenging vicarious trauma head on. In 2019, the National District Attorneys Association recognized this need, and I was fortunate enough to be invited as a founding member of the Wellbeing Task Force. For those of you paying attention, yes, that's the WTF. We as leaders in the prosecution community came together and said, enough is enough. We are tired of losing passionate criminal justice professionals to burnout, addiction, and suicide. We knew we had to shift the narrative away from, it's just part of the job, to, we must be better for one another. Already, we published hundreds of articles and blogs for lawyers and criminal justice professionals talking about what vicarious trauma is, how it impacts you and your coworkers, and how to get support. Last year, we started a well-being app, and the task force hosted its first well-being annual conference. And no, it wasn't just yoga and meditation. 10 years ago, the sexual assault investigation community created a program called Start by Believing. Because we know that if a victim feels supported and believed during their initial outcry, it can make a profound difference in their life. As the district attorney, I now get to train the next generation of prosecutors. And I have found this same philosophy applies to a criminal justice professional who's struggling with trauma. We now train them to say, I need help, and it will be welcomed, and not met with, it's just part of the job. I believe you. What can I do to support you? Is what they should expect. This is not change for change's sake. This is a generational reckoning, institutional reckoning, a generational shift which says we must be better. We must embrace these truths that vicarious trauma is real and that we must be better for one another. Caring for you, our communities, starts with caring for ourselves. To stand up and be the voice of the voiceless, we must take care of ourselves and each other. Even this aggressive, rigid career prosecutor finally asked for help. You can too, and it will make all the difference. Thank you.